You are listening to the Mother of All Talk Shows podcast with George Galloway.
This is London, but broadcasting to you, of course, all over the world, thanks to the wonders of the internet. We touch on not just the big issues of the day, but the issues that are not issues, but ought to be issues. And one of those is now taking place again in Paris this weekend, in France indeed, throughout the French Republic. 59 weeks, hundreds of thousands of people have been on the streets of France. They have been gassed, bludgeoned, bullets, rubber bullets. People have lost their eyes, lost their hands, lost their fingers in the ferocious defense of Macron, the Bourbon president of France. The police and the riot squads of France are notoriously violent, but they have not intimidated the great people of the French Republic. So, vive la France, I say, for 2019, and may God give them success in 2020. It's a good time to look back for a minute or two about the year we've had. On this side of the pond, the biggest event, of course, is the British general election, which ended up with a Tory landslide majority based on the vagaries of our electoral system. No doubt the Tory vote actually only went up 1%, and Jeremy Corbyn still polled more votes than his predecessor, and his predecessor on the final time of asking. That's Tony Blair, Gordon Brown, and Ed Miliband. Corbyn got more votes than any of those. He lost, of course. And because of our electoral system, he lost big in terms of parliamentary seats. And it is a big defeat in terms of the cultural seismic shift behind the red wall, as they say, in the Midlands of England. The Midlands, the North East, the North West, West Wales, South Wales, Labour's position is increasingly parlous for many reasons, the greatest of which was Brexit. If Jeremy Corbyn, the same man as fought in 2017 and won a remarkable score for Labour, 40% of the vote, the biggest increase in the Labour vote since Clement Attlee in 1945. Same leader, a manifesto of left-wing policies. In 2019, it failed. In 2017, it did fantastically well. What's the X factor? What's the difference? The difference, of course, is Brexit. If Jeremy Corbyn had told the Blairite ramp around him, no, we're running in the 2019 election on exactly the same Brexit policy as we fought on in 2017 and did so well, namely that we accept and respect the result of the Brexit referendum. If you elect us, we will refashion our relationship with the European Union in our own image, of course, as would be our right as the government of an independent Britain. But he did not do so. He capitulated instead to the people who are now rubbishing him from a great height. The people who are effectively declaring him and his friends as non-persons, effectively seeking to airbrush out of Labour history. And I predict that they will succeed. You know, I like predictions. Here's my prediction. The next Labour leader will be Sir Keir Starmer. The left of the Labour Party doesn't have a credible candidate. Rebecca Long-Bailey is nobody's idea of a leader. She will not stand up to the rigours of the leadership hustings and the campaign trail. Ian Lavery, the miners' leader, the working class man of the North, pick him and the left might have a chance. But given that 22 Labour MPs have to nominate you, it's quite clear that Rebecca Long-Bailey and Ian Lavery cannot both be on the ballot paper, for there are not anything like 44 left-wing Labour MPs. So one of those has to go. If Labour is listening, Rebecca Long-Bailey will not be able to do it. So put your weight behind Ian Lavery, the miners' leader. But I don't believe that they will do that, because Ian Lavery knows that Swarfiga is not a Greek island. Ian Lavery talks in a way that the metropolitan, inner city, elite, liberal elite that the Labour Party membership has overwhelmingly become don't understand. Ian Lavery is a difficult man to understand if the limits of your purview is North London and the liberati that live around you. But I am very clear about this. If you pick Rebecca Long-Bailey, you will lose, and you will lose to Sir Keir Starmer, the man who was the architect of Labour's downfall, the man who made it impossible for Corbyn to take a sensible Brexit stance. He'll be your next leader, and if he is, he will leave a gigantic piece of political territory to his left, and he will set free hundreds of thousands of active socialists who will no longer credibly be able to be a member of a party led by a knight of the realm and a highly dubious record as the director of public prosecutions behind him, not least in the case of Mr. Julian Assange. Last year, of course, was another year of Calvary for Julian Assange, who ends this year behind the grim prison walls of Belmarsh, Britain's Guantanamo Bay, and we recall and remember him at all times and prepare for the public relations battle to come to stop his extradition to the United States of America. I predict that Britain will Brexit joyously at the end of January next year. There'll be a lot more mugs like this on view, a lot more flags, a lot more bunting. Britain will experience a patriotic surge. The left, the Labour movement, has to go with that. If you are seen as the anti-national, the anti-British, the pro-EU, the people who cannot stomach their own flag and their own nation and its culture and its traditions and its history, then you yourself will be history. I predict a big surge in buy British, build British, think British. We have an opportunity. Brexit is necessary but not sufficient as a condition for building the kind of Britain that I and many of you want to see. But we must Brexit. It is necessary. And we'll have a better Brexit Britain if we are seen to be a part of this new dawn for Britain. If we are the people crying to drag the people back into last year and the stasis of neither leaving nor staying in the European Union, we will be done for. And since I'm in the predictions business, let me predict that Bernie Sanders will win the Democratic Party's nomination for president. I've been confident about that, as you know, all throughout this year. And I'm more confident about it now as the year ends. And I'm absolutely clear of something else. If Bernie Sanders is not the Democratic Party candidate in that election, Donald Trump will win a clear victory in the Electoral College again next November. And a second term, Donald Trump will be unleashed upon America and upon the world. There are other elections, of course. The third election in a single year in Israel as Benjamin Netanyahu seeks to hang on to power so that he can stay out of prison. Yes, it's as basic as that. The only way that Netanyahu can stay out of the penitentiary is still to be the Prime Minister. He's already partly there. He just won a landslide victory in the Likud leadership election. 72% voted for Netanyahu. So he is still the man in pole position. Now, you may say that that doesn't speak too highly of the membership of the Likud. but there's enough of them to give him between 33 and 35 members in the Knesset. His rival, Benny Gantz, with roughly 35 to 37. It's all about who can make the coalition. And my money is on Netanyahu. So there's a third prediction of the evening, that next year at this time, Netanyahu will still be the leader of Israel, which means, of course, there'll still be never-ending war against the Palestinians under Israeli occupation, war in the Lebanon, war by other means in the Lebanon, war in Syria, and war in Iraq. The conditions, the situation in the Arab world is unbelievably febrile. The situation in Iraq has slipped from bad to worse in the couple of weeks since we talked to Dr. Sami Ramadani about it. Well worth looking back at that interview now. The situation in Lebanon is perhaps even more critical. The powers, the Western powers, and the Arab Gulf powers are determined to bring down the government in Lebanon unless they expel the Lebanese Islamic resistance movement, Hezbollah, from power and influence in the state. That will not work because Hezbollah represent probably more than half of all the people in Lebanon. So the situation there is looking grim. Now, the situation in the European Union after we leave is going to be grim too. Germany is almost certainly already in recession. France is printing money like Billio to avoid going into recession. Italy is already in recession. Any breach in the trading arrangements between Britain and the European Union could be fatal for European economies. So again, I make a prediction that the European Union will settle with Boris Johnson in terms of the free trade agreement that he is looking for on favourable terms to Britain, because the European economies cannot risk the slump if sales to Britain are interrupted. I've probably run out of predictions to make at this point, at least in the programme. My prediction now is that you're in for a wonderful show. We have 3 top-flight guests here on the last mother of all talk shows of 2019. We've even got a poll. If there was a fox in your hen house, would you A, kill it with a baseball bat, B, chase it on horseback, I think that's supposed to say, or C, strangle it with a kimono? This is the reference, of course, to a famous Queen's Counsel, Julian Mon, who literally battered a trapped fox to death, battered its brains out with a baseball bat. That's notable for a number of reasons. First of all, the said Queen's Counsel was wearing his wife's kimono at the time. Secondly, this man drips with liberalism and greenness. He is, I understand, a supporter of the Green Party. He is an idol of the liberal chattering classes. And he was Mr. Anti-Brexit. He fought several highly remunerative legal battles to try and stop Brexit in the last 12 months or more. And he's the kind of man who not only beats a fox's brains out with a baseball bat whilst wearing his wife's kimono, but he tweets about it in triumphalist terms. So, if there was a fox in your hen house, would you A, kill it with a baseball bat, B, chase it on horseback, C, strangle it with your kimono? You can vote now on my Twitter feed at George Galloway. Just hearing that at least 2 people have been killed in a church shooting in Texas. It's believed 1 more person has been critically injured during the incident at the West Freeway Church of Christ in White Settlement in Texas. The suspected shooter is believed to be one of those 3 people. 1 person died at the scene of the shooting, while another died en route to a hospital. This follows and horrific attack on Hanukkah on a rabbi's house in New York the day before, in which, again, multiple people were killed and injured by stabbing in that case. Sorry to put a damper on it, because I'm joined by my favorite American broadcaster, Katie Halper, a writer and host of the Katie Halper Show. Katie, welcome to the show. Let's start with that miserable, melancholy news, if we may. It's not getting any better in America, is it? Violent mass killings. The one in New York that I was still recoiling in horror from before learning about this one in Texas. It's a banal question, but do you go around worrying about your personal safety as a normal person in the United States?
I don't. I think maybe as a matter of kind of, ironically enough, survival, like mental, it's a self-defense mechanism probably, because if I thought about it, I'd be pretty like debilitated by fear. Rationally, when I think about it, I realize that this is a scary place to live in terms of gun violence in this country. But no, I really don't walk around thinking about it, but maybe I should.
Yeah, well, I'll think about it for you. I'll be praying. Okay. I'll be praying for you. Now let's look ahead to 2020 vision in advance. What's going to happen, first of all, in the impeachment process against Donald Trump? This is a most bizarre situation. The House of Representatives impeached him, but they didn't communicate that to the Senate, so there can be no trial of Donald Trump. So he's in what we Roman Catholics call a kind of limbo. Neither one thing nor the other. Is that how you see it?
Don't you guys call it purgatory?
Yes, purgatory, yes.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I think that, very quickly, I just want to announce I have a new show, just to give a very quick plug, because I think your viewers and listeners will want to hear about it. It's called Useful Idiots. It's on it's a Rolling Stone podcast, and it's with my co-host, Matt Taibbi.
I definitely want to see that. Where do I find that?
It's on YouTube and wherever you get your podcasts. So, brilliant. iTunes, Stitcher, all that. But it's the video's on YouTube. And actually, it's relevant because Matt has been one of the biggest critics of impeachment. There have been a few people. And, what's really ironic, and this happens a lot in U.S. politics, is I think that the people who are most attached to identifying as Democrats and, vote blue and have a real kind of like personal identity bound enmeshed with being a Democrat, they're often kind of can't see, because they're not as rational, I think, what would be good for resisting Trump. Whereas people like me, of course, I'm biased, but I find Trump reprehensible. I think he's awful, but I also think that there are ways we can resist him that are more effective and that are more moral. And, a couple of weeks ago, we heard Nancy Pelosi defend not impeaching Bush, even though she knew, she said, because she was on the Intelligence Committee, she knew he had misrepresented, i.e. lied about the WMDs. And to me, that was such a significant moment, and it was such a great kind of symbol of what's wrong with the Democrats. And there are ways you could go after Trump. There's a question of, there are two separate but related issues, which is the strategic value and then the moral value. Clearly, I think this is not the most pressing moral issue, and it's so typical that the Ukraine conversation, which this is what the impeachment basically hinges on. It's so amazing that that story in itself requires looking into the corrupt nepotism of Joe Biden, which I think like the Dems are just okay with, I guess. But I think that it reads to other people as real hypocrisy. And, I want to resist Trump for, his trying to help overthrow the government in Venezuela, for arming Saudi Arabia. That's what's important, I think. That's the moral priority and the urgency. And that's, the thing with the Russia and Ukraine stuff is that it doesn't move the needle in any way that hurts Trump. I think what happens is that people who are kind of the Obama to Trump voters who we could win back, they don't care about this. It doesn't affect them. And people who stayed home who are, who don't like Trump but weren't motivated enough to get out of the house, they don't care about this either. So you have a very kind of insular, out of touch group of people who are constantly saying the walls are closing in on Trump. This is the smoking gun. And they've been saying that for years, and it hasn't happened. And now, yes, he has been impeached. And then, but as he said, no trial. And I think Trump will use this also to his advantage. He will spin this as another victory for him. For himself, he'll say that they didn't have the evidence to convict him. In a trial.
And he's raising record amounts of money on the back of it. I mean, truly gargantuan sums are flowing in. So clearly the people with money in the United States, the people who are benefiting from this extraordinary stock market boom that he has presided over, however long that lasts, they are predicting with their donations that Trump is going to still be around. And therefore, somebody's wrong. Either Nancy Pelosi and her gang have called this right, or they've called it so horrifically wrong that the Democrats are going down to another victory, which leads me to the Democratic primary. I have a strong feeling now that Bernie Sanders is going to win the Democratic Party nomination, despite all the efforts and the saboteurs in his own ranks. What's your view on that?
I mean, it's hard. I don't want to jinx it, and I get so excited saying it, but I think it could be true. I mean, I used to think, and there's still some of this, that there are people in the Democratic Party, high-ranking people, apparatchiks, who would rather Bernie lose the primary and someone win the primary who loses to Trump than Bernie win both. Yeah. But those people need to be, marginalized and ignored and put in their place. We have seen a weird shift among some people. There's some examples of, people on MSNBC praising Sanders. I mean, Al Sharpton did this the other day. Also, there's an article by Sydney Ember, and I wrote an article myself on Sydney Ember's anti-Bernie bias, and even she wrote an article about how he's tough to beat. Of course, they're little digs. Yeah, they're little digs incorporated into that.
Sure, but they're now recognizing these polls in which they literally blank out his name. They tell you who was first and who was third, but not who was second.
Exactly, and I actually tweeted about this. It's on my Twitter. It's my most recent tweet. I can pin it so that people can find it. But I tweeted about it, and I said, what do people think of this pro-media Sanders coverage? And there were a couple different responses. And one was that they just have to finally deal with the fact that he's doing very well. And then another one is that it's a trick. It's like it's the calm before the storm. A lot of people said that. And I think that it could be both. It could be a combination. I get the sense that maybe they're realizing that Biden would just do terribly in a debate with Trump, that he would kind of ruthlessly mock Biden's cognitive skills. And then maybe they are realizing that, if they want to defeat Trump, this is the way to go, which is clear to anyone, I think, who follows politics and is kind of honest or is able to separate their personal feelings and maybe some of their self-interest from the larger political landscape. Because, for so many reasons, Bernie is the most electable against Trump, ranging from how motivated and excited his base is, how much people who like him, absolutely love him and will come out and vote, how much the young voters love him, how he did better in the Rust Belt than Hillary Clinton did, for instance, and how he's popular there. I mean, you have people a lot of people will say, oh, he'll never win because he's a socialist. But I know people who are, in upstate New York, where I spend some time, I know people who are very kind of right-wing and populist, and they don't like socialism, but they also get that this guy is honest. There's a real consensus about Sanders' honesty, and I think that really resonates with people. And so we saw, for instance, in the election between John McCain and Barack Obama, there were people who did vote for Obama, even though there's this apocryphal, I don't know if it's a real story, but people saying, I'm going to vote for the N-word, which I bring this up because it's a pretty distasteful, disturbing example. But the point is that people got over or were willing to vote despite their racism for Obama. And I think there are people who are willing to vote despite their discomfort with the term socialist. I also think what happened is that people kind of wasted they blew their wad on trying to make Obama look like a socialist. And Obama was fairly popular. And so I think that kind of destigmatized the word. And I think, of course, young people don't care about that.
Very interesting indeed. Katie, the N-word is one thing. What about the J-word? It's high time, isn't it, that America had its first Jewish president? Bernie Sanders is that potential first Jewish president. And yet there are people trying to persuade others that America's first Jewish president is in fact an anti-Semite. Tell us about that.
I mean, and actually, I really want to have you on my show. We can talk about this after. I'll email you because I'd love to talk with you about the British elections and how much that term was weaponized.
Yeah.
But, or that idea. I mean, I think that people are trying to call him a self-loathing Jew. And I actually wrote a piece about this in Jacobin about how Sanders does represent a very rich, that sounds not rich like wealthy, but a very
yeah, absolutely rich.
Jewish tradition.
A rich seam. You know, I spent much of my life, Katie, imagining that if someone was a left-wing person on my wavelength in America, they were almost certainly going to be Jewish. That goes back a century or more. And it's still true today. Although many Jews in America have moved to the right, it's still the case that most of my best icons on the American left are Jewish. Yeah,
it's true. I mean, there's a really rich tradition of leftism, and from ranging from people like Bernie Sanders to Noam Chomsky. And I unfortunately, I think AIPAC gives a very unrepresentative view of what being Jewish means. But this is a really interesting thing because, of course, you have all these people who talk about identity, and somehow Sanders critics, when they talk about identity, somehow his Jewish identity doesn't come up, or people try to claim that he's not really Jewish because he's not religious, which is a totally different issue. There are tons of Jews who are not religious. I'm one of them. And I have a very strong Jewish identity, but I'm not religious. I'm secular, and that's a tradition. But yeah, I think what they're going to try to do is call him a self-loathing Jew, or point to the fact that he has people on his, who are surrogates or involved in the campaign who they like to claim are anti-Semitic, and they're not. I think one of the greatest things is hearing criticism towards Israel. It's kind of ironic, but also logical, like we were saying, given this rich social justice tradition, that the most critical voice and most compassionate voice towards Palestinians, and by that I mean the person who actually, sees Palestinians as human beings with deserving of human rights, is a Jewish guy. And I think that that's pretty amazing. But yeah, I think that honestly, I'm hoping it won't work because I think he's so unabashed and so unapologetic about his politics and about his identity. That I just think that it works among like a very elite crowd of people, and I think the rest of the world doesn't really care about it.
That's a very key point that you've just made. You said he's so unabashed, he's so enthusiastic about his politics. Right. And that is a key difference. We'll talk about this when I come on your show. That's a key difference with Jeremy Corbyn, you see.
Right.
He ran away from this issue. Capitulated, surrendered, threw his friends under a bus. But Sanders is not doing that. He's on the front foot, ready to take on all comers. He knows that it's now or never. But let's contemplate for a moment the unthinkable. The Democrats pick Joe Biden instead, a man who looks for all the world to me like a waxwork dummy. I feel he's going to melt one night in front of the TV lights.
Yeah, well, his eye already exploded.
Studio. His eye exploded. His teeth shot out across the studio floor. I don't mean to mock, but that's what I saw with my own eyes. If they do, then Donald Trump will triumph. As sure as eggs are eggs, he's going to take a beating from Donald Trump, don't you think?
Yeah, I do. I mean, it's interesting because I'm someone who I'm pretty honest about my politics. Everyone knows that I'm a huge Bernie Sanders fan. But I also think that I'm able to distinguish between the person whose politics I like and a person who's electable. And to be honest, to be fair, at the beginning of this primary, I thought there were two people who could beat Trump, Joe Biden and Bernie Sanders. And I was able to distinguish between electability and my own preference because I don't like Biden at all. But then, as the primary went on, it wasn't his distasteful politics, which I find repulsive, but it was in terms of electability. I think what it was is that I just comes across as not with it. He comes across as, and it's not an ageist thing because Bernie Sanders is a year or two older than him, and he's totally, with it. I think Biden has just kind of lost it, and I think that Trump will be absolutely merciless with him. He'll impersonate him. He'll make fun of him. And yeah, Biden is just like, I mean, we're used to him saying these gaffes, whether they're really gaffes or they're intentional. We're used to those things. But the way he kind of just stalls and can't remember his website, that's something that I think people find troubling. And it's also one of the things that makes me think that maybe if this shift in media coverage is genuine, then maybe it's because people realize that Biden really can't beat Trump and they're finally getting behind the person who can. So you have people at the New York Times and MSNBC kind of changing their tune. Now, again, it could be possible that this is the quiet before the storm, which is what a lot of people are saying, and that's how they responded to my Twitter query. But no, I really think that Sanders is the only one who can beat Trump. I think that he appeals to people who don't believe in the political system. He and Trump both speak to people who are in pain. Now, Trump is a con man, and he speaks to them in a dishonest way.
He's selling them snake oil, Yeah,
exactly. And there's a really dangerous thing where people compare them to each other as if they're similar. Now, what they don't realize is they're actually making an electability argument for Sanders, because what Sanders does is he appeals to, I mean, the whole Bernie bro myth is totally dead. They can't use that demographic identity-based argument because, unfortunately for them, Sanders' campaign is less male and less white than any other of the candidates, his base of support. But I think that what we see is that Sanders and Trump both speak to angry people, and that's where they overlap, sure. But the key difference is that Trump says, blame Mexicans and Muslims, and Sanders says, don't blame Mexicans and Muslims, blame, corporate greed and structural inequality. And when people don't get how significant that difference is, it shows that they're really not able to see politics clearly. And they have some weird aesthetic issue with Sanders and Trump and not a policy-based one.
Well, Katie, I've got to tell you, there's nobody in public life has a better record of prediction than me. And before you came on, I predicted that Bernie Sanders is going to be the Democratic Party nominee. Okay. Thank you very much indeed for joining us. Thanks for your time. The best of luck with your new show. I hope you gain many more viewers as a result of your appearance this evening. Katie Halper, thank you. Tareq Haddad, distinguished writer on Newsweek, one of the biggest selling magazines on the planet, has resigned from his very important position in international journalism in protest at fake news, or at least the refusal to publish real news, the real news that he himself had helped to uncover, principally about the chemical weapons attack, as was or wasn't, at the site in Douma, which led the world closer to nuclear war between the superpowers than at any time since the Cuban Missile Crisis. I'm glad to say we've got Tareq Haddad online now. Tareq, first of all, I metaphorically take my hat off to you. You're a hero to me. Tell us what led to your decision. What led to your decision that this was a line that they had crossed and you could not go with them?
Sure, and thank you for having me on the show. I think I'm going to assume that your listeners and watchers will be fairly familiar with the kind of outline of the story, so I won't go into too much detail about that. But the line for me personally is, when evidence started to, well, first of all, it was published by the Mail on Sunday. Peter Hitchens wrote a story, and now he's written several stories about these leaks. Particularly one letter was verified by Reuters journalists, about these leaks. So when I kind of took this to my editors and tried to write a story about, the information contained within these leaks, and I was, pushed back for doing so, that was the limit, because, for me, I understand, sometimes news stories, if they're controversial, they can, they need solid sources. But this is kind of the first time I've ever seen, in my experience as a reporter, where, something that's been published in a reputable British newspaper, regardless of what you think of the politics of the Daily Mail and the Mail on Sunday, they still produce quality journalism. It's that goes without question. And then also Reuters, which is sort of the gold standard for journalism. Excuse me. If Reuters have verified this information, and then I'm told that the information is not valid, then that was the line for me. And then
did they say, Tareq, that the information wasn't valid, or just not validated enough yet?
Well, I think an interesting part of this whole debacle, I think, is that there's a very new trend in propaganda and in journalism, in that because the industry has been shrinking, more and more people are starting to rely on places like Bellingcat. Now, I'm sure many people will still believe that Bellingcat are this gung-ho team of investigative journalists that are solving crimes all across the world. But I don't think many people do know, and what they should know is that they're funded from dubious sources that are linked to US military interests. So essentially they are a propaganda arm of the US and the UK militaries. So what's happening is that reporters like me that try to write certain stories that contradict the official narrative get told, no, well, Bellingcat have done this refutation. But as I pointed out, and I encourage your readers and listeners to go to my website and read the full article where I've laid everything out. But this trend of saying, Bellingcat have done this, so we won't touch it. When this happened to me, I actually took apart the Bellingcat article that they sent to me, and I addressed every single point that was raised, and kind of showed it how it wasn't, a correct representation of what was going on and why it was still a valid news story. After I'd done this, they didn't have any valid response for me, really. It was just, oh, we'll discuss this in person. And then, when I tried to discuss it, I was simply told, sorry, but it's going to have to be a no. And combined with a few other factors, which I'm happy to get into, that's when I kind of discovered this is something corrupt going on.
And did they in any way react to your resignation? Did they know that it would become really quite a big issue? I'm bound to tell you, I don't often discuss what's in Newsweek, and I haven't picked up a copy of it in many years. But everyone's talking about Newsweek and Tareq Haddad and the Duma story now. Do you think they properly appreciated the consequences of this?
No, I don't think they did at all. And funnily enough, I mean, I'm a journalist. I want I want journalism to thrive. I wasn't trying to do this to sort of damage the reputation of journalism, even though I am probably as critical of them as anyone can be. I try to raise the fact that, listen, this information coming out about Syria is growing by the day. I understand kind of it might be controversial to say certain things about the Syria, the narrative, but my experience has always been, if the evidence I have is solid and I can back it up with good sources, which I can do in this case, I've never had any issues writing the story. I tried to discuss with my editors, saying, I understand this is controversial, but the evidence is growing. If we don't discuss this, we're going to look stupid. And I did mention that in an email to my two editors, including the editor-in-chief in New York, Nancy Cooper, and my London bureau chief, Laura Davis. I mentioned both of these things, wrote both of these things, and what I actually got in response was a character attack of myself as a journalist. And, that was the moment when I
tried to shoot the messenger.
Exactly. And anyone who's got experience of journalism or these types of stories knows that, when the messenger is shot, as you say, and the facts are ignored, kind of who's telling the truth.
Who's calling the shots, literally. Do you think if your name had been John Smith rather than Tareq Haddad, that this would have had exactly the same outcome?
Yeah, I think so. I don't think there was anything to do with my background involved in it. I mean, I'm a British citizen. I've been living in the UK for about 20 years. And, I've never had any issues with other reporting. In fact, my background, my Arabic background, which I make no attempt to hide, has often been a useful thing for me in my journalism. I'm not fluent, but I speak Arabic, and that makes some things a lot, gives me a certain advantage in journalism. I think it's more of a wider issue that there is kind of a mainstream media-wide cover-up of this story. And essentially, as I point out in my article, there is a very worrying trend which may be known to people within the industry, but it was unknown to me, and I felt like it should be known to the wider public, is that a large amount of journalists are directly linked to think tanks that operate, that make a profit from going to war. Think tanks like the Council on Foreign Relations and others like that. And so they're going to do fellowships in these think tanks, and all this information is public, and then they will come and work in newsrooms where they'll decide what information should or should not be presented to the public. Now, the editor that refused my story, I demonstrate in my article that he's, was a fellow at the European Council of Foreign Relations. There's certain different things in his history that show that, he's got a clear conflict of interests, because he's clearly been in an environment where he's fostering relationships with people from the US State Department or other officials and politicians. And, our job as journalists is to hold the government to account, which should be fairly obvious to say. If someone is, directly being funded by the US State Department or, think tanks of that nature, for me, I think, that is the clear problem that's leading to this kind of whitewashing of this story.
Well, the great Irish journalist Claude Coburn, who coined the phrase, "nothing is true until it's been officially denied," and who characterized the proper relationship of a journalist to the power as the dog to the lamppost. But in fact, most of what is still called the mass media, though the mass is thinning rather dramatically, is the dog is urinating the other way on their readers and viewers and listeners. And that's one of the reasons why the so-called mainstream media is really not all that mainstream anymore. You identify two clear conflicts of interest, and let me summarize them. The Bellingcats and other such think tanks produce microwave-ready stories and refutations that can be easily published or broadcast without costing the media house in question any money at all, because that's already been paid for by the US or the UK or other states. And the second is that the media is they don't have an annual conference and decide, what lines to take and all that, but they automatically all face the same way. And in the case of Syria, isn't it the case that it was that the media had invested in the state narrative that the regime in Damascus must be destroyed, and that any story or narrative which in any way mitigated against that, even where true, had to be suppressed? Isn't that so?
I would say that's the case. I mean, I'm trying to be a little bit cautious in my wording in terms of, even though what you're saying is correct, my kind of point is that I think despite this, there are still honest, good journalists out there. And I, like I said, I'm not doing this to try and damage the reputation of the media. What I'm hoping, is that honest journalists, and they do exist, start pressuring their editors to report this story. Even though I've been kind of in the middle of all this attention recently, at the end of the day, I don't think, the story is not about me. It should be about a very, a long history of what's been going on in Syria and how the media has failed to cover it properly. And I think, honest journalists need to start addressing that. And I think part of the issue is that actually many reporters, surprisingly, aren't aware of how this propaganda operates. That many people probably aren't aware that Bellingcat is funded by these dubious sources. I think too many people, have gone into journalism without the proper training in how the media has been, manipulated over the years, or how this propaganda really works. I was in a slightly fortunate position if that was kind of my main driving force of getting into journalism after the Iraq War. It was kind of, while I was still very young, and as I decided I wanted to be a journalist, it was something that fascinated me. So it was something I studied. But I think to a lot of people, it's really not known. And then if journalists don't know this, I think to the wider public, even though I'm sure a lot of people had their suspicions about Syria, given the history of everything. But I don't think many people in the public know about Bellingcat and how modern day propaganda is affecting the narrative. So I think that's what I'm trying to do, and hopefully, something positive will come out of that.
Well, that's very loyal of you. I can't say that I agree with you. I'm looking through the glass at a 50-year veteran of British journalism, and he doesn't agree with you either. I don't believe that any of these journalists on mainstream media are not aware of what it is they're involved in. And the heroes like you and like Peter Hitchens, a man of the right, a deeply conservative man who's not Arab, who's not Muslim, who's not a supporter of the regime in Syria or any other regime. In fact, I've yet to find a regime that he finds favourable. But he has, virtually alone in the English media, been determined that the truth will out about all of this. So you're a rare breed. You're in good company. Tareq Haddad, thank you for joining us on the mother of all talk shows. What are you going to give up in February? A, Twitter. B, cigarettes. C, other. Plenty of scope there. I myself, I never drank alcohol, and I've given up smoking 5 years ago. So there's not actually much left that I can give up. Maybe the odd potato. Rob Marin says there's no such thing as the Labour Party anymore, or the Democrats in the US. It's flipped left to right, right to left, up, down, down, up. That's an interesting observation. Tell us your thoughts on that, Adam.
Well, I think that what he's getting at, and it's very important, is that the core working class voters that would make up the Labour Party in Britain, and which in the United States made up a vast amount of the electorate for the Democratic Party, they've been left temporarily homeless by the normal parties of affiliation. And into that void has slipped first Donald Trump, who ran on issues of let's protect industry, let's invest in industry, your jobs are being taken away and I'm going to prevent that from eroding any further. And in Britain, there was less of an emphasis, to be fair, on the industrial jobs issues than with Trump.
But Brexit was a proxy for those arguments.
Absolutely, because Brexit, all the people that were frustrated at the decline of industry, frankly, the theft of industry, which took place gradually, and in many ways not so gradually, since the country was undemocratically taken into the EU, the EEC as it was then in 73, people were venting their frustration, and quite rightly so. So I think that the writer is absolutely right.
George, seeing that the UK is lumbered with a right-wing Tory government with all that implies, what do you think would happen to the special relationship, if God willing, Bernie Sanders, a socialist, were ever to get to the top job in the US. That's from Richard. Now, you don't think that Bernie will beat Trump. You don't think anyone can beat Trump. But just imagine that you had a more left-wing leader in the United States than we've got in Britain. What would that do to the special relationship?
Well, we don't have to even look to a left-wing leader because Donald Trump, whilst not left-wing, was very much anti-establishment on the foreign policy front. And what did it do to Britain? It confused Britain. It infuriated many in the British foreign policy establishment. It arrested them. It beguiled. It befuddled. And I think a lot of that was also due to the fact that when Trump was elected, you had Theresa May, who is about as inflexible as an iron rod. But with Boris, and if it were to be Bernie in the White House and Boris in number 10, I think what you'd see is Britain reducing its role in foreign affairs because there would be no American coattail to hang on to. This, however, assumes that a Bernie Sanders foreign policy would be similar to, let's say, a George Galloway foreign policy, which I don't think would be the case if he were to win. And as you said, I don't think any of them can beat Trump. I think Trump is quite Teflon. But if somehow he was to get in, I think that he would make a deal with this so-called deep state and say, I'll do my domestic stuff without hindrance, but you lot can take care of the foreign policy business as usual.
Let's take Asim in Edinburgh on China and the Uyghur Muslims. Go ahead, Asim.
Hi, George. How you doing?
Good, thank you.
I'm very good. I hope Adam's doing fine as well.
Yeah, we're all in fine form. Yes, go ahead.
That's good to hear. So basically, my question is you've obviously got a bit of a briefing. So it's about China, obviously. So the situation we're in Xinjiang, and basically my question really is really straightforward. What can other countries do to try and stop China? Because China's an economic superpower. It's like right now it's at number 2. I mean, what sort of
stop China doing what?
Well, we're aware of what's happening in Xinjiang. For example, they're putting Muslims or Kazakhs as well into what they call re-education camps, which we know isn't true. We know they're concentration camps. We know fine that they are.
How do you know that? Tell me how you know that. What are you basing that on?
Well, what we've seen in the media and all the people that have come out of it.
You don't want to believe everything you read in the media, Asim. You didn't believe it when they were saying it about Jeremy Corbyn, did you?
No, absolutely not. No.
You see my point?
Yeah, I do.
There is a massive propaganda barrage against China, and its target moves. You're too young to remember, but there was once upon a time a man who thought he was God, called the Dalai Lama, was the flavour of the month in Western propaganda. And China was routinely accused of butchering the Tibetans, crushing their culture, starving their people, and it was all fake news. And nowadays, people go on holiday to the Chinese province of Tibet and marvel at the wonders that they see. There was, again before you were born, the Falun Gong, a bizarre religious cult that were supposedly repressed by China, and they became the flavour of the month in Western propaganda. The Muslim question is the latest. Hong Kong is another. I've got my own criticisms of Chinese policy towards its religious minorities, but I don't accept for 1 minute your apparent thesis that millions of Muslims in Xinjiang are in concentration camps. And there's no evidence at all to back that thesis. Adam.
Well, it is a bit funny that the same people, literally the very same people who don't care about Muslims in Libya, in Syria, in Iraq, in Kashmir, in Nigeria, in so many places, magically they found the one place on earth where they pretend to care about Muslims, but even that is going to, frankly, shift. And I think it's going to leave a lot of people who think that there's going to be some great liberal crusade in hand with misguided and misled Muslim populations against China. They're going to be disappointed because the main foci of the anti-China infowar is on Hong Kong for a very simple reason. Very few people in the outside world go to Xinjiang in northwest China, but many go to Hong Kong. It's a financial center strapped on to a giant shopping mall. And beyond that, the people in Hong Kong are, at least their made-for-TV image is quite relatable to people in New York and London. They're a-religious, like people in London and New York. They dress immodestly, like people in London and New York, and they live that kind of lifestyle. So when it comes to hitching the anti-China bandwagon to a stallion, trust me, it's not going to be the Muslim stallion. It's going to be the Hong Kong stallion. But even that one hasn't really come in first place.
There is a problem with Islamist extremism in China, as indeed there is in England.
Yes.
And in every country around the world, actually, including Nigeria, to which you just alluded. China is struggling with that. There are tens of thousands of Uyghur Muslims in the jihadist armies in Syria, yes, for example. That's why China is now paying much more attention to the Middle East and to the Syrian theater in particular, because they know that these throat cutters learning their trade in Syria are going one day to be back in China, and they're going to have to fight them there. So China is wrestling with the existence of Islamist fanaticism in Xinjiang, which is, of course, a Turkic-speaking area of China, receiving a lot of propaganda and some financial, maybe even some military support from some Muslim countries, the usual suspects in particular. I still think that China could do much better in explaining its situation to the world. For example, it was a big mistake for China to react to Mesut Ozil, the Turkish footballer's comments, by making an immediate blackout on Arsenal and on Ozil, and by extension on Turkey. He's Turkish. It was a mistake to do that. They should have used that to open up this debate, this discussion that I'm doing on their behalf, unpaid, I should say, this evening. They should explain to people what's going on in Xinjiang, because there's lots of people like Asim around the world who think that China bans Ramadan, forces Muslims to eat pork and drink alcohol, and has incarcerated millions of people in Xinjiang in concentration camps. China should be dealing with this much better than it is.
Yes, and one of the interesting things about Chinese media is it's not really programmed for this world of Punch and Judy international propaganda, international information, call it what you will. Things are improving in a way. There's a bus service now that goes between Xinjiang and Lahore in Pakistan, which is, of course, the closest ally of China in the Muslim world, arguably one of China's closest all-weather allies in the world. And there have been many scholars, many tourists, many people from all walks of life in Pakistan who have written about their personal experiences of going from a Muslim country, a formerly Muslim country, over the border into China and seeing that things, whilst different than Pakistan to be sure, it's not this kind of repressive, hellish situation that people in the Washington Post and others who found the WMD before they set a foot in Iraq were so eager to tell the world. So I think that what China ought to do is open up and say, you're invited to come and take a look for yourself. And to be fair, they're doing that more than they have, but the defensive posture, which in a way is understandable, it alienates potential sympathetic ears and eyes and feet.
Great. Let's hear from Mike in South Carolina. He's got a question for you, Adam. Go ahead, Mike.
I want to talk about Bernie Sanders, but got one quick thing I want to say about China, and that is they have shown far more restraint than the Obama administration would have in that same situation in Hong Kong, because Obama was very quick to stamp out all of the protests in New York City regarding the one percenters. You know what I'm saying? I mean, they went all over the country, closing down all of the Occupy Wall Street and the rest of it. And that's not happened in Hong Kong.
Mike. Good point.
But as far as Bernie Sanders is concerned, Katie had her finger on the pulse of what's happening in the United States. Adam thinks that Trump can't lose this election, but he needs to understand that even by Fox News standards, over 50% of the people in the United States want Trump not only impeached but removed from office. And how can you win? How can you possibly win an election when over half the people want him removed from office?
Well, in an opinion poll, that's true, but the election isn't fought by opinion poll. Neither is it fought on the popular vote. And I agree with Michael Moore, who said this week that Trump could well lose the popular vote again, even by more than he did against Hillary Clinton. But because of the rules of the Electoral College, still win the presidency. Adam.
Well, yes, I agree with that, even though I would go a step further and to say that I think that this time he'll win the popular vote. I mean, if Bush could do it, for God's sake, in 2004, Trump, who's a 10 times more charismatic figure and much more unique figure, a much more nationalistic figure than Bush the Terrible, I think he'll be able to win quite comfortably. I think depending on who his opponent is, we could see the biggest gap since 1984, when Ronald Reagan crushed Mondale decisively. My view is, if the Democrats pick as weak a candidate as they'll probably pick, I think that we could see the Democratic candidate winning 5 states or less. So when it comes to a prediction, I'm not setting it in stone because a lot can change between now and November of next year. But if they pick a weak candidate, which I suspect they will, I should think that they might win 5 states or less, with all of the others going to Trump.
Mike, last word to you.
Yeah, I would say this about that. Trump himself and the Republican Party cannot win this election. The only person that can lose the election is the Democrats, and they're well on their way to doing that if they actually allow Joe Biden or somebody like him to become their candidate. If Bernie Sanders is the candidate, he will win this election hands down. But the only way that Trump can win is if the Democrats give it to him, and I don't put it past them because there are so many establishment Democrats running the DNC and the DCCC that they actually might elect, use their superdelegates in a second vote to put in somebody like a Joe Biden, which is an automatic loss, and that's the only way Trump can win.
Mike, thanks for the call from South Carolina. Of course, if the superdelegates put in someone like Joe Biden, there would be all hell would break loose in the Democratic Party. The possibility of Sanders in those circumstances making a third party run would be, I think, enormously powerful, in which case your man would win even more handsomely.
Which is one of the reasons I think that he would be restrained from doing so, because even though his base would be livid if they put an Elizabeth Warren or a Joe Biden or one of the others in their place, or they were to steal it from him, the way, frankly, that Hillary and her people stole it in 2016, there would be a lot of people who would shift from being pro-Bernie to just being anti-Trump. Because among the people who hate Donald Trump, they really hate him. And I think that there would be a lot of cajoling going on to say, Bernie, don't do it. Just hold your nose and say that you'll smile and take a Polaroid picture with Elizabeth Warren.
Sure, but they don't even have a House of Lords they can elevate him to. There's nothing they can offer old Bernie except a chance at the presidency. So I think they'll find it difficult. They'll certainly find it difficult to carry his base. I mean, the idea that Sanders voters are going to transfer to Joe Biden is frankly ridiculous.
Many will either stay home, or if Jill Stein runs again, which she may well do as a Green Party candidate, I think a good number of Bernie people would go over to her.
Adam, can you please tell us who will win the Scottish Premiership this season? Thanks, James in Dundee. Shall I answer that for you?
I think it's probably a safer bet.
The famous Glasgow Celtic. Greetings, George and Adam. I'm from the country of Slovenia. Sorry in advance for Melania and Klobuchar. But in school, we never had an in-depth analysis of what exactly happened during the collapse of Yugoslavia, Tito's Yugoslavia to be exact, and what was Slovenia's role during these events. I was born years after the initial tragedy, and my parents and elders gave me conflicting accounts of what happened. I can't get an objective picture, so I was wondering if Adam can bring some clarity on this issue. It's a big issue. Maybe we should have a proper debate on it, but have a stab at a brief synopsis.
Well, the first thing that came to my mind is, you know you're getting old when someone from the former Yugoslavia asks you what happened during the collapse of the former Yugoslavia. That was the first thing that came to my mind. The second thing is that Slovenia was the only constituent republic of Yugoslavia that seceded peacefully. It was the first to declare independence in 1991, and although there was a kind of political skirmish, there was no real fight in any meaningful way, the way there was in Bosnia-Herzegovina, Croatia, the Serbian constituent element of Kosovo, and to some degree Macedonia, which is now called North Macedonia, and may well be subsumed into a greater Albania over the next 5 years. Slovenia was always a funny one, because whilst it was a Slavic country, like most of the rest of Yugoslavia, and whilst it was a majority Catholic country like Croatia, there was always something to do. Slovenia was always sort of 1 foot in the wider Austrian world, in spite of a different ethnicity.
Germany drove the recognition of independent Slovenia.
Yes, quite so. And they even...
Mrs. Thatcher wasn't happy about that.
Yes.
She opined quite strongly that the Germans had prematurely triggered the problems in Yugoslavia by prematurely recognizing breakaway states.
And she was also very upset with her erstwhile friend George H.W. Bush, because she was very reticent to see German reunification happen so early. And her views were really a generational thing rather than anything to do with her party. But by the time Slovenia seceded, she was already having dealt with the reunification of Michael Heseltine and John Major, far from being worried about the breakup of Yugoslavia and the reunification of Germany. But long story short, culturally, Slovenia's always had 1 foot to the north of the rest of Yugoslavia. And because of that, I think that's why it wasn't a blood-soaked secession, as almost all of the others were.
Philip in New Jersey. He thinks Biden's stronger than we do. Go ahead, Philip.
Yeah, hi, George.
Hi.
I backed Bernie in 2016, and I really back him strongly this year. But I think you and Adam and others are underestimating Biden. I think Biden is just more popular with average voters as opposed to college-educated voters here and in the UK than you might think. And he reminds me of George W. Bush, who made a lot of mistakes when he would, in some of his speaking, but nevertheless, average voters liked him. And I think also this election, as many in the Western world and in the U.S. Today, is more about who you don't want to win. I think voters in the U.K. look like they did not want Corbyn in office, and they wanted Brexit, so they voted for Boris. I think this election in 2020 will be, do you want Trump or not? And I think 50% of the people hate him, maybe 42% like him. And I think Biden, even though he's clearly losing a step, attacks on him will fall off just the way attacks on Trump and his womanizing and, paying off prostitutes fall off. Everybody knows that. They either accept it or they don't. And I think there will be absolutely no third party running, because I think no Democrat, and even Michael Bloomberg, will ultimately risk seeing Trump elected. And I think you shouldn't forget the secret weapon Democrats have in 2020, and that is none of them are Hillary Clinton. I couldn't stand Hillary. I'm not sure if she's the only Democrat running that I'm not sure if I'd vote for. I think she's just deeply corrupt, more than Biden. I think Biden's son Hunter's a grifter, but I'm not sure Joe is that way, whereas Hillary was. And Hillary's also just an avid warmonger, as you well know. And I don't think Biden is as bad. And I think Bernie's, a lot better than Biden. But I think, they win. And I think they're both good enough to win in the key industrial states. They take somewhat different voters. Bernie will take more anti-establishment voters, more younger people, and Biden will take, I think, more of the older white voters who aren't so entranced with left liberalism. But, Biden is a kind of older Democrat, maybe similar to some older Labor Party.
Well, I think that's a fantastically good call, and that it's counter to what we've been saying makes it the more valuable. Let me ask you a question or two, though, Phil, before I ask Adam to respond. I absolutely take your point that amongst the general electorate, Biden is not as weak as I suspect he is in the primaries, because, of course, whilst many millions vote in the primaries, far more people vote in the general presidential election. I think that Bernie will win because his base amongst politically active people and politically conscious people, who are the most likely to vote in primaries, is much greater than Biden's. And my second point to you would be this. I take your point that insulting the diction, the vocabulary, the facial characteristics and simian knuckle-dragging of George W. Bush worked in political circles but didn't necessarily amongst the general public, many of whom are not particular linguists themselves. When it comes to the debate, the many debates, it seems to me that Donald Trump would pulverize Joe Biden. He's not strong enough to stand up nowadays, maybe once upon a time, but he's at least 20 years past his sell-by date. I feel that he would be pulverized by Trump. Your response, Philip?
Well, I think he has clearly lost a step since 2012, but if you look at 2012's debate he had against Paul Ryan, it was the single best debate performance of any of them, including Obama and Romney. He really handled Ryan very well, pushed back on Ryan's avid desire to cut back on the welfare state, in particular Medicare and Social Security. And that's always been a good Democratic Party response that they often don't make. And I also think Biden performed very well against Sarah Palin in 2012. And that wasn't as easy as people would think, because a lot of people were looking to see if Biden would look down on this, outsider, first-time governor candidate who's a woman, that he might be acting like he's superior to her. And I thought he handled that well. So I thought he has been a better debater than people think. I admit he's lost something, but again, I think just like with Trump's own issues, which Hillary mistakenly emphasized constantly, including in my state, which was ridiculous to advertise in New York City when it's a heavily Democratic area, but I saw ad after ad on Trump's temperament. Everybody knows that. Everybody knows about Biden's issues, I think, when they watch him. But, I think a lot of the older whites, again, are comfortable with him. And a lot of the others, younger people in particular, like my sons, I think will vote for him anyway, just to get rid of Trump. And they know Biden will be a one-term president. And, again, I hope Bernie wins, but I'm going to vote for Biden anyway. So
interesting. Let's ask Adam for the final word on this then. Adam.
Well, I agree that essentially he's past his sell-by date. When he was reading Neil Kinnock's speeches with the vigor of comparative youth, that was one thing, but it's a very different Joe Biden. And unlike Bernie, who's still, rocking and socking, and unlike Trump, who's no spring chicken, but he's rocking and socking, I think Biden's days of reading Neil Kinnock's speeches with enthusiasm have definitely waned. But then there's the X factor, which is, what is Trump going to do over the next 11 months? And these are my predictions, all of which bode well for him at election time. One, I think he's going to accelerate a trade deal with China, which will be good for the markets, good for prices, good for the agricultural industry in the US, which, to be fair, has been the only industry hit hard by the China trade war. I think that, two, he's going to have some more successful summits with Kim Jong-un, free of the walrus, barking in the corner. That would be John Bolton. He's gone. He was the main obstacle to peace. And so I think we're going to see Trump get to play the role of being very presidential, doing a peace summit with both Korean leaders. He'll probably doubtless talk to the Chinese president and the Russian president about the issue and look very statesmanlike in the process. And I think with those things in mind, so long as the trade deals can carry the markets and the jobs numbers forward into 2020, it's going to be very difficult for the people who are already on the fence but leaning to Trump, because he hasn't been big and bad. He hasn't destroyed the economy. He hasn't appointed some pornographic prostitute as Secretary of State, even though that might have been an improvement over some of them. And he hasn't started a new war. He hasn't taken jobs away. The jobs numbers are good. The problems with the American economy, which whilst many are systematic and due to a flawed monetary policy, due to the Federal Reserve, not due to Trump per se. So long as Trump can keep things going and look presidential on the world stage, I think he's going to be very, very difficult for anyone to stop.
Do you believe we'll ever see an end to identity politics, or will it only get worse? That's from Edmund Neurtier. I thought the apex, nadir, was reached today when the Lake District was lectured that even though it's rammed with tourists and can scarcely accept any more, it must try harder on its lack of diversity. There are too many old white people going on holiday and on trips to the Lake District, said the local tourism boss. That's identity politics gone mad, hasn't it?
Oh, totally gone mad, because because people go to the Lake District for one reason only, to see the natural environment. So if the natural environment is repelling people on a racial basis...
Not just racial, but everywhere. I mean, there are too many straight white men in the Lake District.
So you've got a racist tree, a homophobic lake, a xenophobic rolling hill of grass. I mean, it's totally ridiculous. I mean, what do they want? Should Prince Charles hire an architect to build a monstrous concrete carbuncle with a Burger King in it to make it more like London? I mean, come on.
In rainbow colours.
Of course.
Let's hear from Hamid in London. Hamid, welcome.
Hi. Good afternoon. I just wanted to say, you were talking earlier about China and how they treat the Muslims and extremism. But I live in London. I wanted to say, why the British government still allows Saudi Arabia, Qatar and other countries to fund mosques in the UK? Surely it should be made illegal the same way, because what they do, they send imams here. Imams are only one of the categories where they still issue work visas. And they bring these guys over here and they preach this hate doctrine. And then you get radicalism. Why doesn't the government? It's very simple. They say we want to fight radicalism. Why don't they stop the funding of mosques by this, Wahhabi ideology which comes over from Saudi Arabia?
It's probably a question of money, and I'll ask Adam in a minute. But my answer would be prefaced by this, Hamid, that the British government actually has never wanted to fight Islamist extremism. In fact, the British government's been in bed with Islamist extremism since the 1950s, since the fostering of, the harbouring of, and the fostering of the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt as a cat's paw for British policy against Nasser, President Nasser, the greatest of all the Arab leaders. And Britain has harboured, as a matter of deliberate policy, Islamist extremism here in our own country. I give you the most obvious example being the fighting Islamic group in Libya, the Libyan Islamic Fighting Group, the clue being, as I always say, in the name. We fostered, harboured, helped, facilitated the Libyan Islamic Fighting Group. We harboured them in Manchester. One of their children blew up our children in the Manchester arena. And they did so as a matter of deliberate policy, so that they could one day use this Libyan Islamic Fighting Group to destroy the Gaddafi regime in Libya. Adam.
Well, I think that the caller makes a very important point. If you can't have a foreign regime funding a political party, why should they fund a religious institution or a religious sect or even a religious building? So I think if you went after this on the financial line, saying, look, any donation over, let's say, £5,000 to a religious organisation from a foreign government or from a registered entity abroad, it needs to go through some very stringent checks. And I think that that would hopefully be the beginning of getting local people to shape the kind of religion taught in religious schools of all denominations, religious institutions, houses of prayer of all denominations, because one doesn't want churches or mosques or any other religious institution to be surreptitious tools of foreign interference. If it's good enough for political parties, why not for religious institutions?
Last word to you, Hamid.
Yeah, I think it's true. And also I wanted to say why, for example, when something happens, we were talking about identity politics. Why, if it's a Muslim, they always have to mention the Muslim? You know, the taxi driver was Muslim, you know, when they had the thing in Rotherham. But if, for example, Epstein or Weinstein or Philip Green or whatever, nobody mentions their religion. But if it's a Muslim, they always have to mention their religion. Why? Why, if, for example, somebody is the first Muslim this or the first black this, when are we going to get past this identity thing? Sorry to say, but I mean, the BBC says, oh, we are very unbiased, but they are the worst ones because they shove this down the throat of everybody. You know, the first Muslim mayor of London, the first black president of this. Surely, if they are all the same, they shouldn't be putting these labels on people.
Good point, Hamid. Thank you for that. Simon is also in London. Go ahead, Simon.
How are you doing, George? You okay?
Yes, good. Thanks. Thanks for calling.
Merry Christmas, by the way, to you and Adam.
To you also. Thank you.
Yeah, and a Happy New Year as well, of course, yeah.
Cheers,
yeah, despite everything that's happened in the last few weeks with regards to the Labour Party, the most disappointing and disturbing part of this is the fact that Corbyn could not defend his friends, no matter what happened, regardless of whether people under the bus, thrown under the bus, against ludicrous claims, false claims of anti-Semitism. He kept apologizing for absolutely no reason, when all he needed to tell right-wing journalists like Andrew Neil was that Judaism is a fine, peaceful religion, and Jews are great people, but Zionism is a poisonous, racist, right-wing political movement which should be open to scrutiny and criticism, like any political movement. For me, the fact that he couldn't even make this simple differentiation shows to me that everything he's getting now, he kind of deserves. Now, even when this week, or last week I think it was, a gutless, spineless jellyfish like Tony Blair came out and blamed Corbyn for racism, anti-Semitism, and being so left-wing that he became unvotable, he didn't defend himself. In fact, if anything, Theresa May's aide came out and defended Corbyn, which is extraordinary, I find. You know, which kind of leads me to a question, George. Has Corbyn actually thrown this election deliberately?
No, not at all. But his character defects are displayed by the kind of failures that you identify. The very same characteristics that got him the nomination as Labour leader in the first place. You see, nobody else except Jeremy Corbyn could have got the then necessary 40 nominations. No other person on the left could have got that. I certainly couldn't have got that. John McDonnell couldn't have got it. No one else but Jeremy Corbyn could have got it. And he got it because he was universally regarded as a weak and nice and harmless character. And so people lent him their vote that had nothing in common with his political views, and they openly admitted afterwards that they then felt extremely foolish because he had gone on to win the contest. The one in particular, the former deputy leader of the Labour Party, she described herself as a moron for having done so. She did so because of the very characteristics that make up Jeremy Corbyn, which later made him unable, unwilling, you could argue which, to stand up against the onslaught and stand up for his friends. Margaret Beckett was not the only one. There were many others. David Lammy nominated Jeremy Corbyn. Emily Thornberry nominated Jeremy Corbyn because none of them, Sadiq Khan nominated Jeremy Corbyn. None of them imagined that he could win. And they could only do what they did because of the very characteristics that then played out in real time over 4 years that made Corbyn's leadership in the end a failure. Simon, thanks for the call. Bob is in Maryland in the US. Got a question for Adam. Bob, go ahead.
Yes, thank you for taking my call. I just wanted to ask, I've run across recently the notion of the militarization of space, and the thinking was that a country, a very powerful country, could put a platform in place with a nuclear weapon and position it over a country and ask or demand their cooperation. The basis or the root of the question is the cavalier manner, and I'm using that in quotes, in which nuclear weapons are spoken about. On Earth, they're just totally devastating, but the idea of having a platform over a country, and could he speak to that and just the way that, again, this nuclearization is spoken about?
Such a good question, Bob. Thank you very much for that. It's almost sacrilegious, isn't it, weaponizing the heavens?
Well, yes, even though I'd rather bomb the moon than bomb Earth, because unlike certain conspiratorial radio shows, I don't think there's anything on there. But getting to the serious point...
Not even Elvis?
Posse's there eating the cheese. In an alternative universe where Hillary is president of the moon, winning both the popular and electoral vote. But getting to the serious point, there's already enough nuclear weapons on the planet to destroy the entire planet several times over. So this whole weaponizing of space, it's sort of the space race 2.0. It's about challenging your opponent to see how much money they can spend, trying to find out how much technology that they have, but maybe haven't been flashing out in the open through these provocations. Because the main nuclear powers can destroy any country in the world through ICBMs that are launched from Earth. So the entire thing, it's a bit of a dangerous vanity project, but I don't think it's materially going to change anything. If one of the main countries wants to destroy another one, they're more than capable of doing it.
Thanks for that, Bob. Robert is in Florida. Go ahead, Robert.
Hi. Hi, George.
Hi.
Hi, Adam.
Hi there.
Okay, so you're talking about Bernie Sanders, and I shudder at the thought of a Bernie Sanders presidency. In fact, I shudder at the thought of any of these people becoming president. My real opinion is no more presidents. How about that? I mean, what are they really good for? They're really not serving the interests of the American people. It's all about foreign policy. But my point about Sanders is socialism and communism. There's already incredible money printing happening here in the United States. I'm not hearing any specifics from Sanders. I'm not hearing any specifics from anyone about anything. And the media has everything to do with this as well. So there's so much. I don't get what Sanders, what everybody would want up in Sanders, because essentially, I mean, what is communism? And agree with me if you wish, but the state sets your value as a person. Right?
Adam, this is up your street, I think.
Yes, well, I was talking about the systematic problems with the American economy earlier, and the caller talked about the printing of money. Well, the so-called left likes tax and spend, and the so-called right likes borrow and spend. They can all agree on print and spend, and it's going to destroy America because the dollar is still the international reserve currency. Why, I don't know. I mean, I do and I don't, if you get my drift. But that is going to be the cause of the next depression or the next recession, because, lo and behold, monetary irresponsibility, government and central planners interfering with monetary policy has been the cause of every great modern depression on earth, and just about every depression even before the modern era. So I agree, when it comes to the monetary policy, you can't put a cigarette paper between any of them, because they all think that printing money is somehow good when it represents literally a theft from the most economically vulnerable, and in the longer sense, it represents building a house of cards that will fall on the backs of all of the people. So I agree, when it comes to the macroeconomic issues, which are centered on monetary policy, there's a disaster waiting to happen no matter who's in charge.
Thanks for that, Robert. Jamal is in Virginia. Let's hear from him. Jamal? Jamal, are you there? We've lost him. Okay, let me deal with some of the written ones, because there's lots of them. Ask Adam, which politicians, pundits and writers have most shaped your views?
Living, dead, current? Well, I suppose he didn't specify.
No.
And
we're short of time, so...
Right, okay. So my favourite British politicians: Benjamin Disraeli, the third Marquess of Salisbury, Joseph Chamberlain. My favourite international politicians: Deng Xiaoping, Otto von Bismarck, and Robert Taft from the US. And in terms of my favourite thinkers, I suppose Nietzsche, Freud, and Spengler.
Well, that's a quick and comprehensive answer. Chris Strange says, what do you think David Lammy's chances of being elected Labour leader are?
I'm seeing a needle go through the eye of the camel, and then the camel's laughing at the chances of David Lammy getting through.
I think that's right. Jamal's back on the line. Go ahead, Jamal. Jamal, are you there? No, we still don't have him. Be a voice for the voiceless, ask Adam. Should faith schools be banned?
No, of course not. That would be, we talked about communism. That's one of the things I hate most about communism. I think that banning faith schools would be absurd.
The Flat Earther asks, I wish to ask Adam, how much of an economic boost can we expect to the economy in terms of trade, GDP, jobs, etc., when Britain signs free trade deals with the USA, Canada, Australia, China, South Korea, Japan, etc.? And do you think the EU will refuse to sign a free trade agreement with Brexit Britain?
I'll answer quickly because I can. I think that the trade deals are going to be one of the best things, if not the best thing, to happen to the British economy since the early 90s. And as for the second question, I think that the shareholders at places like Siemens, VW, Mercedes-Benz, they're already shaking in their clogs. So even I realise those are Dutch, but yeah, there's going to be a trade deal.
Michael Gone.
Not Michael Gove.
No, Gone. Michael Gove is listening but not phoning. George, what's the gripe with Jess Phillips? She may not be leadership material, but she speaks from the heart and usually makes sense. Michael, are you in Ward 5, Broadmoor? She speaks from the heart and usually makes sense. She's the most fake working class brummie, my backside, that I have ever met, and usually makes sense. I've never known a parliamentarian to make less sense. Your view?
There's a taverna somewhere in Athens missing its Aristotle impersonator. No, Jess Phillips is... She's something other than else to put on, a Star Trek voice. She's incompetent, she's incapable, she's irritating, and those are just her good bits.
Chrissy says Trump has stated 3 times on camera that he hopes Biden will win the nomination. Why do you think that is? Because Biden will be a complete pushover and the world will suffer 4 more years of Trump. Of course, Chrissy, that could be a double bluff. You know what I'm saying? Now, our sound desk has been hacked. Having seen off the cyber attacks 2 weeks running, Moscow's defences were so robust by week 3 that we repelled all borders. But now our sound desk has literally been hacked. So big apologies to Norma, the legend, and Jamal, who won't be able to get on. And I'm sorry to say we won't be able to take any more calls this week. But don't worry, Moscow will move with alacrity and great might to quash this latest attack on the mother of all talk shows, I'm perfectly sure. Zachariah says, America's not a place to be afraid like that. Y'all are ignorant and must never have walked the streets of this country. Like every other country, there are problem areas. And Bob Chanel says, we don't have a left in the US. The Democrats have moved to the right of what was once considered moderate Republican positions. And here's an interesting one from James. If England had an independence vote, what would the result be? What do you think?
Oh, it would be a total damn squib. It would just be totally silly. There's actually a party called the English Democrats.
Yeah, they don't get far, no.
Their leader is famous for trying to say Brexit had already happened, which was an admirable case, but no, there's not going to be an English independence. Independence from what? It's just silly. It's just silly.
Kevin Tewey, without national healthcare systems, health getting poor and life expectancy declining for the average American. And Patrick says, what do you make of the Catholic social justice influenced American Solidarity Party? And do you feel that a Chestertonian influenced political party is viable in Yankee land? It's above my pay grade. Do you want to have a stab at that?
Well, I've never heard of the party, but if we're going to talk about morality in politics, there was actually a story I read just a few hours ago that I think summarizes the last 10 years of at least Western history. In the MOD, which for our international viewers or for people who watch Channel 4 is the Ministry of Defense, they've built what they call gender-neutral lavatories, which means the men and women in the same place. Of course, my headline was female MOD employees don't like the sound of the men dropping bombs next door, but that didn't make the papers. But what that showed me metaphorically is that you can't change human nature. You can say that you want to have a breakdown of all these gender barriers and that it's sexist and the rest of it, to say that you're opposed to men and women excreting their various fluids and sometimes solids next to each other. But as someone who's met men and met women throughout most of my life, I know one thing if I know anything. Women do not want to be anywhere near a man using lavatorial facilities. You can't change human nature. But I actually am quite pleased that they did this at the MOD, because if they could get this experiment to work, there would be world peace. If they could convince the women to sit next to the men dropping their bombs in the loo. But it's not going to happen.
Mabuhay from the Philippines. Happy New Year to George, Adam, and the rest of the MOATS family. That's from LCSIAO. And Peter, talking about Tareq, Haddad, an educated journalist, species rare. Alison Mason says, hi from Greece. Greece's public health service is also being sold off under EU diktat. Abdul Wahab Qasim Ibrahim, Happy New Year to all viewers. Roger Manifold says the truth is a diminishing commodity that thankfully this program provides an antidote to. And Jack Lakeland says, I don't think Trump blames Muslims and Mexicans. He blames those who have managed migration so badly in the past. He didn't say all Mexicans are rapists. He said the Mexican government was allowing them to cross the border. He didn't have a Muslim ban. It was his predecessors. And Switch says, please screen the callers for sub 100 IQs. Not at all. I think the IQ quotient on this program is second to none. In fact, I don't know of any program over 3 hours on politics and current affairs anywhere in the world that matches this program for the quality of those talking to you from this side of the camera and the quality of those making calls from New Zealand, from South Carolina, from all over the world. People are listening and contributing to this show. I'm sorry about the hacking of our sound desk. We really will have to attend to that. But it's been marvelous for me. I hope it was for you. And if it was, then come back next week at the same time in the same place and bring another viewer and listener with you, because I'm determined that we get to this number 1 million before very much longer. Wishing you all a very happy New Year.